Well, hello, everybody. I know we have quite a number of people RSVP'd for this, so we're going to let folks come in as over the next couple of minutes, but we would love to have folks introduce themselves in the chat. Given the number of people we have on the call, on the webinar, we won't have time for folks to introduce themselves live, but would love to have everybody have a sense of who is on the call. We were very excited looking across the RSVP list at how cross-sector and diverse the group was. So, thank you for making time to come talk about root causes of slow growth today. We really appreciate the time. And one more piece of, just sort of housekeeping while we are here. We will have the Q&A open while we go through. So ideally, if we could use the chat for chat and then the Q&A for questions, it just helps us as the presenters keep track of uh, the questions and make sure we're trying to get to them all. We will, of course, watch the chat as well, but if you put your question in the Q&A, we will be able to track it better. So thanks for that. So maybe we could advance the slide one. So again, thank you for being here today with Greater MSP. We are excited to be hosting this follow-up webinar from Compete. So many of you were at Compete. If you weren't, no worries. This is a sort of standalone uh, deep dive. We will reference Compete a few times, but you don't have to have been there to follow what we're doing. And I I'm going to turn it over to our CEO, Peter Frosch, to just kick us off with a little bit of additional context about why Greater MSP is hosting a webinar today and bigger picture why we are thinking about growth, slow growth, root causes of slow growth, all the things we're going to talk about today.
Thanks, Julia, and hello, everybody. Um, Today's webinar is part of a new series of connected dialogues. So some of you have been participating in small and large events and webinars going back a number of months. And they're all focused on building the next economy of a region and state. And they are anchored on some of the big questions, like why do we need to build the next economy of a region and state, and how would we do that? Um, in short, we're going to get into a lot of detail today, but the answer to those questions, in some ways, is quite simple. It's about the people who live in this region and in our state. It's about Minnesotans having more opportunity and more economic security, and making sure that we preserve and extend a nation-leading quality of life. This is about data. You'll see a lot of charts today, but it's really a conversation about our future. And our future is something that we need to shape together. And that's why we're so excited that we have leaders from all kinds of different sectors and all different types of organizations from a lot of different geographies joining today, because this is a conversation that we need a lot of people to be a part of. If you were at Compete, one of the messages you heard is that the economy isn't a business issue, it's an all of us issue, because we all, in some ways, are participating in it, and we all are either benefiting from its success or struggling, when it's not realizing its full potential. And understanding why our economy isn't realizing its full potential today, you're going to see some of that story. That's really important, and that's what this webinar is about. I'll start by reminding you about some of those basic facts, and then we're going to dig into the why. And this is some new insight that no one has really seen before, and we've just been working on for the last number of months. So we're excited to share out. We expect it's going to stimulate a lot of conversation. I think Julie is going to hit the point. Like, we're not trying to solve a lot of things today. We're trying to follow the facts and understand kind of where we are and why we are where we are, so then we can make good decisions about how to go forward. So thanks for spending some of your precious Minnesota summertime here, learning about our region's economy. Back to you, Julie.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Peter. So as Peter said, we're really diving deep on one particular topic from Compete today. So what slow growth means and why it matters. We'll go through a little bit of just a refresher on some of the data that has been shared and has been driving this conversation. And then the question we get the most often when we have this, when we show this data is typically why? Why is this happening? And so we have put together a few, you know, obviously this is the webinar. We have put together a few thoughts on that. Now, I will say this several times throughout the webinar. These are hypotheses, so these are, you know, strongly supported with data. We wouldn't put them out there if it wasn't supported with data, but these are really complex issues, and so we are excited to be talking with you about them. We know that our understanding of them will grow and deepen the more people ask questions and engage with us and share their perspectives. So, you know, an invitation to, again, ask questions and comment and follow up with us and help us as a region develop our better understanding of these root causes. So many of you did submit questions when you registered. Thank you for those. We're going to try to hit as many as we can today. Again, root causes of slow growth, main thing we're here. So thank you for those who posed that question. You are in the right place. We will try to get to as many of these other questions as we can. These questions reflect broad themes of what we saw in the questions you submitted in your registration, and so helped us as we were pulling together the slides for today. I know some people had much more specific questions. Again, we'll try to cover as many as we can, and do feel free to follow up with us afterwards if there's more conversation you'd like to have. So we want to just recap a little bit of what we heard at Compete. Slowing growth is holding families and communities back. That's really our focus today. We will touch a little bit on our inspiring plan for the next economy and the strategy we have moving forward. But really the focus today is on this foundational understanding of where we are today and the impacts of that slow growth rate. So a snapshot of where we are in our 2026 Regional Indicators Dashboard. We have a high ranking quality of life. You heard this throughout the conversation that we had at Compete. You also see it when you look at the Regional Indicators Dashboard that out of our the 50 largest regions in the dashboard, that we are, you know, top 10, top 20 percentile in many of these quality of life measures. And at the same time, we have sluggish economic growth. So we have a few more charts coming after this, but here are just some things that we pulled from the dashboard to illustrate the sluggish growth. So obviously slowing job growth. We also are seeing a rising unemployment rate, which is sort of historically unusual for us. VC investment is down, and we are now starting to see this lagging household income growth. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. This is more data than we have in the dashboard. The dashboard is a snapshot in time, and we thought it was important to show, you know, Minnesota's growth has been lagging the United States for quite a while. So bigger picture, Minnesota has been growing, continues to grow, but you really see that we used to be slower than the US, but tracking it pretty closely, right? Like we kind of held pace at just a little bit behind from, since 2005. And then really in the pandemic, you see this kind of gap opening up. You see the same pattern, but potentially even more dramatically in job growth, where you start to see the gap where we were hanging much closer with the United States rate, with the national rate of job growth. And then you see the gap start to open up a little earlier, maybe 2015. And now we are only slightly above where we were pre-pandemic, while the United States is, as a nation, we're quite a bit higher than where we were in the pandemic. So this is just a couple slides to remind us of what we're talking about when we talk about slow growth. And then we have said for a while that we will start to see slow growth show up in ways that people can feel. more tangibly at a household level. And we are now starting to see that in the data. So, when we look at what it would mean on a household level for the state to have grown as fast as the nation, we see that that means the median family would have earned $9,000 more. So this is a little bit of a tricky stat because that's a median family number. The number might vary a little bit based on where you are in the income spectrum, but the bottom line here is that this means there is income that is not coming into Minnesota households because of our slower growth, and that if we had grown faster, Minnesota households would have more money to spend on things like housing, things like education, healthcare, et cetera. And really, potentially, one thing we are exploring is what that would look like on an affordability basis. So, how would higher incomes affect how people feel on affordability? That's an area that we're exploring. So, uh, now we are going into what are the root causes of slow growth. So, when we looked at this, we pulled in, I've mentioned the regional indicators dashboard a couple of times. That was a key source of information for a lot of what we did, what we're about to present here. We also pull in information from all sorts of different places as Greater MSP. So you'll see many of them here. For those of you who are talking with us or informing, many of these projects, thank you. We have, a number of research partners for the dashboard in particular that we wanted to call out and thank. I know many of you are on the call, so thank you for your support and work on the dashboard over the last, year for sure, 10 years for some of you. And again, thank you for joining the call today. And when we looked at root causes, a couple things needed to be true for us to have them rise to the level of a root cause explanation. So we wanted to try to explain long-term growth. So those charts that I showed went back to 2005. So we're trying to explain, the last 10 to 20 years of growth as much as we can, right? So we did not want to look at things like that we know have severe economic impacts. There's been a lot of speculation about AI, for instance. That is not something we looked at as a root cause of slow growth because it wasn't around 10 years ago. We also know that things like there's been a lot of work on the economic impacts of things like metro surge, and that's not a root cause, again, just based on time, the time duration. We looked for causes that were specific to our geography, so not necessarily things that could be true of Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, our peer states, but were more unique to Minnesota. And we looked for causes that we could say, there's lots of different data sources that are pointing in this direction. So we tried not to have it be, this one data source on job growth is pointing us in this direction. We tried to corroborate that with, maybe there was state and regional data or state and federal data or, a survey. So there was a lot of just like pressure testing these root causes. And so here they are. Let's get to the headline. So we have these four big buckets: population, industry, structural inequities, and policy decisions. And so now we get a chance to kind of walk through each of these in more detail. Essentially, I'm just going to say a few things and then get to some common questions before we get into Nathan walking us through the data. So population trends, these are big demographic trends, potentially long lead times, and potentially hard to change. Industry trends, again, big cogs on the economic wheel. We're going to talk here about where our economy is, which sectors we're in, and what that looks like compared to the nation. Structural inequities. Here we looked at racial inequities and some of the structural barriers we know exist and how that might, we know those are of longstanding duration. How might that be impacting our growth? And then finally, we also looked at policy decisions around tax, regulatory, other policy kind of stances. Those we mostly looked at on the state level. As we go through this presentation, we will mostly focus on the state just because there's a broader set of data there, but we will also be talking about the region as well, of course, as the Regional Economic Development Group. And then before we get more into the detailed data, I want to say just there's some questions that we've heard as we've gone through these that we just want to kind of put out there and answer in advance. So, which factor is the most important? These are all, we are not trying to rank these. So, we're not trying to say this is the one thing, all the other ones don't matter. These are all important. It is not a ranked choice menu. Related to that, these are entangled. These root causes interact with each other and can reinforce one another. So, also to the point that it's hard to single out one particular factor, these are really big parts of the economy. And so they interact with each other in complicated ways. There may, and then are we sure there aren't other factors driving slow growth? We are, in fact, not sure. There may indeed be others that are driving slow growth. We are very confident that the ones we're talking about today are part of these root causes, and we are very interested in hearing from your perspective what else there might be that we should be considering. So, just want to kind of share a little bit of what we've heard as we've been having these conversations and address those beforehand. I'm going to hand it over to Nathan now. And again, as you have as you have questions, please use that Q&A function to submit them. If you don't see it on the bottom bar, depending on your screen, you may have to click on the more, those three little dots, and you'll see a Q&A option. And again, we'll watch the chat too, but if you use Q&A, we'll be able to track better the questions.
Great. Thanks, Julia.
So thank you.
Yeah. So as Julia mentioned, we've kind of have these four broad hypotheses, and we're going to walk through a little bit of the data for each one of these that leads us to choose them. So first on population trends. One thing that we found from the 2026 dashboard is that this region has slow population growth combined with a tight labor market compared to peers. So in the past year, the region's population grew just 0.6%. That growth rate is 37th out of the top 50 metro areas in the United States. Meanwhile, our labor force participation rate at 70% is fifth highest among these peer regions. So why do we think this might be a root cause for slow growth? Well, population growth means that there are more people who are circulating money and ideas in an economy. And so it's correlated with economic growth. In addition, a tight labor market is a sign of a strong economy, but it also can discourage new investment, in part because businesses, private sector businesses, which drive the bulk of GDP growth, want to expand in markets that are fast growing in population and that have available workers. And there's concerns that we've heard from businesses that we've spoken with over many years that, there's less upside to expanding in a region that has slow population growth and a really tight labor market. It's worth noting that this population growth trend is not just a one-year trend, right? The dashboard is looking at it 1 year to the next, but it's worth recognizing that Minnesota is on pace for the slowest population growth since the 1980s. This is analysis from DEED and the Minnesota State Demographic Center. You can see in particular in that 2020 to 2025 window, there's been especially slow growth in the number of people in our state. And one piece of the puzzle here is net migration. So this is one component of population growth. There's other factors as well, but many of you were mentioning net migration and the curiosity around that. And what we find, and this is research from the researchers at the Cleveland Fed, which I think really clarifies this dimension, is that net migration, which is the number of people moving out of the Twin Cities metro area compared to the number of people moving in to the Twin Cities metro area. So net migration has consistently been negative for much of the last decade. You can see that red line is consistently below zero. There's a little blip above zero in 2014. You can see it really falls off a cliff after, kind of during and after this pandemic, right? So net migration, there's a significant outflow of residents from this region to other regions in those coming years. And in a bit of a bright spot, and we can talk a little bit more about this, we're seeing net migration actually regain its standing, and we're actually net positive. So we are gaining more people in this region in terms of domestic migration than we are losing them to leaving to other regions. And one element of our dashboard that adds additional insight into this is we look at the population of young adults. So that's people aged 25 to 34. And we find that for among that population, that's really driving the bulk of this net migration, right? So there were 12,000 more young adults that moved to the Twin Cities in the past year than left the Twin Cities. So that's a really promising sign and potentially a signal that we might be in a different place, but still having a decade of negative net migration is not positive for the prospects of economic growth. So it's also worth seeing this in context, right? So as Julie was mentioning, there's questions that we've gotten around peer states and how we're comparing to our neighbors. And it's worth recognizing that Minnesota kind of exists in the Midwest region that tends to have an aging population, that tends to have slow population growth, net out migration as more people move to the South and the Mountain West in particular. And so by this metric, you can see that, Minnesota is not unique in having slow labor force growth, right? It's 35th out of 50 states, on par with Wisconsin over the past 10 years in terms of this population. So there's a kind of mega regional trend that is also at play here. However, one of the wrinkles that's really interesting here is that during the pandemic period, in particular, Minnesota's had especially slow labor force growth. And there was an analysis done by the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development that looked into this and to say, why are we even, growing even more slowly than our neighboring states? And what they found is that retirements were really at the core of this question, right? So there was a surge in older workers in Minnesota that ended up opting for retirement. That is enabled in part, indeed, research found, because Minnesotans tend to have more retirement accounts. They're more likely to have retirement accounts. They have more money saved in retirement accounts. So that enables a kind of a quicker exit from the labor market than peer states. So that's a good thing for those individuals, right? It's great that people are able to afford to retire. However, what that means is that we've got a slow labor force growth, even for our kind of slow growth neighbors and peers. So last thing I wanted to do, just to really drive home this point on population growth being connected to GDP growth, is to show you two different maps that track this. So take a look at this. This is looking at labor force growth over the past 10 years. And this map is looking at GDP growth over the past 10 years. If you blinked and felt like you missed something, you didn't. These maps are actually looking very similar. So I'm going to shift back and forth. You can see the patterns are very, very similar, right? And I think to us, this really affirms that population growth is very strongly correlated with GDP growth. All right, let's move on to the second category, second hypothesis, which relates to industry trends. All right, so on industry trends, what we found is that our region is adding fewer jobs, especially in these high wage sectors, over the past 10 years than the average top 50 region. So the chart on the left shows if you look at all of the industries that pay above average wages, those are industries like manufacturing, professional services, finance and insurance, headquarters. Those jobs collectively grew by about 3% over the past 10 years. Compare that to about a 10% growth rate for the average city in the United States. Now, when you look at below average wage industries, these are sectors that tend to pay lower wages: healthcare, educational services, arts and entertainment, retail. We saw more job growth, right? A job growth of about 7% over the past 10 years. But compare that to about 14% for the top 50 region average. So broadly speaking, what we find is that the sectors, we're not just adding fewer jobs than other regions, we're also adding fewer of these high wage jobs on that. And that matters to our regional economy because the sectors that pay higher wages tend to generate greater benefits for regional economies. There's more money circulating in the economy as a result of these sectors. And we're finding that we have fewer jobs than peers in some of these sectors. And in addition, there's been some evidence to suggest that the legacy industries that we currently have have underperformed on some measures. There was a BCG analysis that looked into this and found that on a measure that they call total shareholder return, the companies that are based in Minnesota actually underperformed, or at best were kind of on par in total shareholder returns compared with even peers in their own sectors. So you might be asking, okay, let's take another step deeper. Let's look at kind of what are these sectors that are kind of growing more slowly than we would expect. And here's where we're going to get into maybe the wonkiest part. So bear with me here. Some of this might make sense, it might be a little confusing. We are happy to go back to it. But we can use something that we call a shift share analysis to understand this. So broadly speaking, what this analysis does is it asks how many jobs would we expect a sector to add over a period of time, given the national and industry growth trends, and then comparing that amount to the number of jobs that were actually created. So the result of that is what's called the competitive effect. It's basically the difference between how many you'd be expected to create over the past 10 years and how many jobs were actually created. And you can see on the left shows some of these sectors that are the most underperforming sectors in the MSP region. And you can see headquarters, digital sectors, low-paid services are some of those sectors that are adding fewer jobs than you would expect given these national growth rates. Now, I want to call your attention to these top two corporate subsidiary regional managing offices. Broadly speaking, that's headquarters and medical insurance, health and medical insurance carriers, right? Those are areas where you can see very high employment concentrations, which means we tend to have a lot of strength. It's a legacy. These are legacy industries that have been very well developed. There are more people working in these sectors here than in other parts of the country. And you can see across both of these, 10,000 fewer jobs were added in headquarters than you would expect, given growth rates, national growth rates. Similarly, insurance carriers, about 9,000 fewer jobs were added in this region than you'd expect. Further down the list, you can see computer systems design services, computing infrastructure providers, software publishers, computer programming services. Those are all areas where we actually have underrepresentation, right? So there are fewer jobs in these sectors than you would expect of a metro of our size. And so it's a competitive disadvantage, and we're seeing some losses, right? They're actually growing even slower than you would expect that they would given the national trends. Over on the right side is the opposite, right? These are the sectors that are overperforming, right? You can see healthcare, government, and some advanced manufacturing sectors are actually overperforming. So services for the elderly added about 8,000 more jobs than you would expect. Management consulting services adding about 7,000 more jobs than you would expect. And then I'm going to call your attention all the way to the bottom. There's a couple very wonky sounding sectors: capacitor, resistor, transformer, inductor manufacturing. That is a key sector in the semiconductor manufacturing industry. You can see we have a very high employment concentration. It's an industry where we've got some real strengths and assets, and it's outperforming what the growth rate that you would expect. So surgical medical instrument manufacturing is another great example. That's a core sector within the med tech sector, which is something that we are nationally leading on, and we are actually outperforming growth projections for that sector. But you add up all of these different industries, and there's a cumulative underperformance, right? There's 120,000 fewer jobs added in this region than you would expect, given the growth rates of all of these different industries. That amounts to about 5.6% of our region's total jobs. So this is the industry story. There's a lot more to unpack here, but broadly speaking, we are not growing in the high growth and high tech sectors that would be able to add a lot of jobs. We are growing in some of the lower paying sectors, but cumulatively, we're kind of down more jobs than we have gained. All right. So that brings us to our third hypothesis, which relates to structural inequities. And some of this will be very familiar to many of you, right? I think it's no secret that structural inequities is a challenge that our region has faced. So there's a lot of research that suggests that structural inequities also limits the economic contributions of residents, right? So there's a McKinsey study from a couple of years ago that shows if we close the racial wealth gap, we could increase US GDP by 4 to 6% over 10 years. And there's local research that actually suggests the Groundbreak Coalition, which is one of the really exciting civic collaborations underway in Minnesota right now, their $5.3 billion in direct investments could actually generate about $9 to $11 billion in total economic output over the next 10 years. So we know there's a real opportunity, there's an economic opportunity to building a more equitable economy. Now, why do we know that's true? Well, regions that enable more residents to participate are benefiting from new ideas, new energy, new markets. And we know that despite some progress in recent years, there are severe racial inequities that exist in the MSP region, and that only matters more as populations of color continue to grow. So I'm going to walk through a couple of those other details. You might say, well, isn't structural racism something that is true across the United States? Yes, absolutely. The challenge is Minnesota has some unique disparities, right? As we all know. Here's one example. There's many other charts we could choose, but this is from the Minneapolis Fed Regional Housing Affordability Dashboard that looks at just the difference in homeownership rates between Black and white households. We find that in the Twin Cities, there is a uniquely large homeownership gap, right? So that would be a cause to suggest that, well, Minnesota is disadvantaged, especially because of the structural inequities that we see, even compared to other places across the United States. You might be asking, though, haven't these racial inequities been existing for a long time? And why would this factor into the slow growth trajectory that Julia was talking through, kind of from that 2015 time period onward? Well, it's worth recognizing that communities of color are driving population growth in our state. This is data points compiled by Minnesota Compass on the left that you can see, growing shares of, growing populations of American Indian, Asian, Black, Hispanic, two or more races, individuals. And to put it simply, back in 2000, people of color were about 17% of the region's population. Today, they're double that, right? About 34%. And so when you think about if there are more people in our region, a higher share of people in our region that are facing these structural barriers to accessing opportunity, that has a cumulative effect of slowing our collective economy down. And I think it adds urgency to the many efforts underway to build a more inclusive economy in our region and state. Okay, so that's structural inequities, and we've got the last one, which is policy decisions. So at the event that many of you might have attended a couple of weeks ago at Compete, our colleague Amanda Taylor, who leads our business investment function, outlined some of the factors of competition, right? These are the things that businesses care about and think about when they're choosing where to invest in new jobs and new capital investment. And you can see, there's a whole range of factors, right? Innovation ecosystem, talent availability, electricity capacity, transportation, regulatory, operating costs, brand, right? So there's all sorts of these factors that really matter to businesses. And it's worth recognizing that Minnesota is very well positioned and very competitive in many of these factors. We have a very highly educated workforce. We've got a fantastic innovation ecosystem anchored by the University of Minnesota and corporate R&D labs across the state. We've got very highly rated transportation and infrastructure. It's part of the reason that we are named a top 10 best state for business, I think 10 years in a row, right? So there's a lot of assets that the state has. At the same time, we have heard concerns from business leaders that has been validated by some of the data that there's other factors of competition where we're a little bit less competitive. So one of these factors is permitting. According to a study issued by the Minnesota Chamber, it was very thorough. Minnesota ranks last in permitting times among peers. This chart on the left is showing the average number of days to issue an air permit. You can see it's compared to states like Colorado, North Carolina, Tennessee, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota's has much longer time frames to issue air permits. Why do we think this is a root cause? Well, business leaders' perceptions shape where they choose to invest, right? And business leaders have consistently shared concerns about Minnesota's increasingly uncompetitive taxes, regulatory process, rising costs. And there's some data that validates this, that permitting is a real significant barrier and can be a disincentive for businesses to invest. Now, it's worth noting that these permitting processes and regulations are here for a very good reason, right? They're to keep Minnesotans healthy, to protect our soil and water, and They're to, ensure that the natural spaces that we all love are, continued to be around for generations. So this is not a case to say that we should not be permitting. Permitting really matters. And yet it's worth recognizing that given that there are some signals that our permitting is uniquely uncompetitive, it might be worth revisiting and seeing, well, what are the ways that we can encourage business investment that we think will make our economy stronger while keeping those protections in place. So another one of the policy decisions that we hear about, and I'm sure many people on the call have heard about, is high tax rates, right? And so we recognize that high tax rates are supporting public services. They also might discourage investment. So this is a map from the 2026 Tax Foundation's State Tax Competitiveness Index. It finds that across all of these different factors, Minnesota's tax competitiveness is 44th out of 50. This is combining things like corporate taxes, individual income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, unemployment insurance taxes. Across all of these measures, Minnesota is not especially competitive. Now, same caveat and discussion that I just shared with permitting. Taxes are here for very good reason, right? To provide public services, to invest in a quality of life that really makes this state and this region kind of a uniquely wonderful place to live for many of us. And at the same time, it discourages investment when business leaders are considering tax comparisons in other states, and they're finding that the taxes are very high compared to other places for Minnesota. And one of the other factors that businesses think about is the kind of cost of doing business. There's many components that go into the cost, but here's one example, which is the cost of construction, right? If there was a new business that was looking to expand into in a new facility in say Minnesota or other states, what they would find when analyzing the data is that the cost of construction is not really a competitive advantage for the Twin Cities. So you can see that Minneapolis the average city has a cost of 100. This is an index that kind of normalizes each of these costs. Minneapolis is above that average at 106. So that means that there's places that we are more inexpensive to build in, right? Chicago, Boston, Seattle. It's cheaper to build here than it is in those cities. But there's a whole range of other competitor peer regions where it is not as expensive to build, right? So Columbus has a cost index of 94, Atlanta 91, right? Denver, Phoenix, Raleigh, Dallas. These are all places that businesses are actively considering. And on this measure, which is constructed by a kind of national data provider on construction costs, the Twin Cities is not offering a compelling reason to move here. Now, you might be raising the case that because of our highly educated workforce, the quality of construction is improved here. I think that I've heard that argument, and I think that very well may be true. It maybe saves businesses money in the long run to have, paying a little bit more for quality construction. But unfortunately, I don't have data currently that speaks to that. And when these are factors that businesses are considering, they look at these types of metrics, that could still be a disincentive for investment here. So these are the four root causes, the kind of hypotheses that we have to understand these trends that Julia was walking through: population trends, industry trends, structural inequities, and policy decisions. One bright spot is that there's really something to be optimistic about for each of them. There's activities, there's work underway that relates to each of these dimensions. On population, as mentioned, we've been seeing in the last year or two a surge in net migration, right, driven by young adults that bring new ideas and new energy. This is a really positive trend, and we want to be monitoring this going forward. On industry, there are active hubs for industries of the future that are being organized right now across private sector, public sector, university, and other collaborators. So medtech, semiconductors, hypersonics, biomanufacturing, sustainable aviation fuel. Each of these are kind of big bets in these emerging, fast-growing, high-value industries that could offer the opportunity of providing good jobs and billions of dollars in new investment that come to this state. On structural inequities, it's worth recognizing there have been real gains in inclusion since 2015. There's been a bit of a backsliding in the last year or two. We've seen some really concerning trends. But still, compared to 2015, there are higher employment rates for people of color. There are higher wages. There's more, greater access to educational opportunities. So there's some real progress that has been made due to many different factors over the past 10 years on inclusion. And there's efforts like the Groundbreak Coalition, which, as I mentioned before, is one of the really exciting civic initiatives in this state that are looking to further push the progress that has been made on structural inequities. And lastly, on policy decisions, there have been a couple signature bills that have really made a difference, right? So the Minnesota Forward Fund was passed in 2023. That has created a investment pool that's allowed the state to secure investment from the federal government and from the private sector, millions and millions of dollars of new investment in really strategic and important projects. And the 2024 Minnesota Infrastructure Permitting Act is an example of offering right of way for new clean energy deployment, right? So this enables a kind of a pathway through some of the potential permitting challenges that businesses face, especially when it comes to scaling up the production of electricity to meet this rising demand to keep costs under control. So collectively, each of these kind of bright spots and areas add up to something that Greater MSP is calling greater growth, right? Economic growth through purpose-driven industries that produce more good jobs for more people, that generate more public resources to improve on our nation-leading quality of life. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Julia to talk a little bit more about the strategies here.
Thanks, Nathan. We're just going to touch briefly on the strategies, and you've done a good job already teeing up some examples of those. But I am going to just talk through a little bit. This is a little bit of a preview of a more systematic look. So when we at Greater MSP and across the partnership with the many partners who we work with, if you're on the call, you're probably partnering with us in some way. We think about building our next economy in a number of different ways. So building industries of the future, we've talked a bit about, and I'm going to spend a little more time on that one because it's really important. We can't just build industries of the future, though. We also want to train people for the jobs of the future in those industries. So an example there is the Microelectronics Workforce Partnership that was mentioned. We want to make sure that we're including more people in the growth, right? So that as we have more growth and more income, that theoretical $9,000 that we mentioned at the beginning makes its way to the median household, right? And that is able to lift up that kind of household and family. Lots of questions in the initial registration were about AI. I haven't seen a lot yet in the chat, but I know AI is a topic that's on many people's minds. And one thing we are working to do here is understand how we can use AI to make it work for us. So Nathan is part of as a Greater MSP representative, is part of a conversation that Brookings is convening around how AI can actually be harnessed to potentially benefit regional economies. So that's something we're really actively trying to understand. And then modernizing the state's role. And we talked a little bit about permitting, but this is also thinking about what's the strategic posture of the state around building industries of the future? Are they co-investing? Are they thinking about research facilities? Yes, we know regulatory landscape and taxes are really important, but what are the kind of innovative areas where the state can potentially step into as it makes sense? And then again, I said I would go slightly deeper on the industries of the future. So on the next slide, we just have a few more examples of what those actually look like. And those are things like med tech, clean industry, next generation food and ag, this deep tech, which is sort of a term that we are coining. But includes things like semiconductors, microeconomics, hypersonics, which is faster than the speed of sound kind of flight. And then we've long had a history in a strength in a headquarters economy. So we are also thinking about what does that look like in the 21st century to have a headquarters economy in a world where jobs maybe less tied to geography than they were before. When there's manufacturing automation, where does the R&D facility go? And is it important to have it near the corporate headquarters? So we're really trying to think about that and be on the cutting edge of that as well. These are industries that pay good jobs. These are industries that are in demand at a global level, and so provide that kind of long-term economic security that we're looking for. And then the next set of slides is just a rapid round of pictures to see like this is working. These are examples of semiconductor groundbreakings. This is a hypersonic kind of groundbreaking. Here we have a SAF facility a blending facility celebration that just happened recently. And so a theme you're seeing throughout these photos is these wins require teams of people, potentially teams of unlikely allies, cross-sector partnerships to really get done. And we know we can do this. We know these focusing on new industries, industries of the future really works for us and is a good formula. So that's something that we're trying to make sure that we continue to focus on and even accelerate. So with that, I want to make sure, yes, and we have even more pictures, sorry. And then we have this was a slide we pulled in from Compete, just to make sure we ended on a more how we keep winning kind of more hopeful note. We do want to make sure we had time for questions. So I see some coming in to the question and answer section. So I might just start going through those. And we're happy to talk about the strategy as well, but I did want to make sure we had time for the sort of questions on the bulk of the presentation we gave. I wonder if, Nathan, you start with the question on income that I see in the chat.
Yes, sounds good.
Are
I'm
you
going to
able to
stop
see those, or should
sharing
I read
as
it?
well. And
Okay.
let's see. So the incomes, have you considered average age of categories by color or race? For example, white people tend to be older. Average age is 40 years versus 27 years for Asian, 26 for Black, 23 for Hispanic. Would that change any metrics? Perhaps you controlled for this. It's a good question. Typically, there are not controls for this, except for the fact that what we are looking at is only working age individuals, right? So you tend to be looking for these types of income or employment measures at, people who are actively in the labor market, whether that is 16 and up. Sometimes it's, 25 to 54, kind of the prime age workforce. So it's a good question to consider. My hunch, though, is that these disparities would not disappear if you just controlled for age, right? That these are long-standing inequities that we have seen now for generations, and that it is not just a function of age. So good question. Thanks for asking it.
I see a question as well about water availability in the future. It looks like this may have been referring to the slide you had around cost of doing business in different states. And I think the question is, many of those places will not have water in the future, and that is coming soon, so this data may not matter as much. Also, we have weather that doesn't have the potential of being catastrophic, so won't that charge change and give an advantage to Minnesota? I think it certainly could change. Like we will be watching that indeed. I think we are already starting to see some inquiries from site selectors or people thinking about locating that consider climate change. They're more looking at catastrophic weather, from my understanding, and sort of insurance premiums. And I am wondering if Amanda Taylor, are you on the phone, and would you like to talk to this at all? Amanda's our VP of Business Investment. We don't mean to put on the spot, but she's definitely the best person to answer this question.
I can also buy Amanda a little bit of
Okay.
time if we're working that out. And just saying,
Yeah.
I think it's a good question, because I think there's a meta question underneath this, which is, what if all of this will just sort itself out, right? Don't we have all these structural advantages? maybe with, being a cold weather state as the climate is warming, maybe with having access to water, maybe we're, poised for a rebound. And I think it very well may, I mean, it very, very well may be that we benefit from structural forces that are beyond our control in the future. But uh, this is a good opportunity to say we cannot guarantee that we will be benefiting. And if we do benefit from these kind of macro climate, activities, there are many other cold weather states that are have the same competitive advantages. So there is still a reason for us to be very intentional about both tracking how our economy has been performing to date and also being proactive and strategic, as Julia was describing, in trying to build an economy that we deserve and can benefit from.
Yeah. Thank you. And then I see two questions that seem to be about capital, both in housing and growth and innovation. And I'm not sure I fully understand the point on housing affordability and how shared appreciation financing could help. But I do think that there's a lot of innovation that's going on around housing affordability. And I know Drenal put in her contact information at Groundbreak, and that would be a really good place to go. I think that the Groundbreak is a place that has private capital players at the table and is really trying to actively shape that. On growth and innovation, I can speak a little bit more. So weaker growth, the dashboard shows weaker growth and business vitality. Venture data shows strong seed activity, but much less Series B, C, D plus. Where's the sequencing gap, follow-on capital mandates, et cetera? What would create a flywheel to scale and recycle returns? This is a great question. This is something we are thinking about a lot, which is this: how do we scale? We are pretty good at as a state at starting things, but many people also have this challenge, and many regions also have the challenge of getting to scale is quite tricky. I know this best in SAF space, where we see quite a bit of, lots of innovation, lots of lab kind of based startups, and then really a gap when you're getting to that first pilot, first commercial, like first out of the lab, first of a kind, where you need either super patient capital or capital that is more willing to take risks or just grants, particularly to finance things like engineering costs that you're not going to that may have a harder time getting repaid, right? That you have to spend the money up front to engineer the design, but it's going to be a while before you have revenue to pay that back. So having a grant to pay the engineering firm is really helpful. Again, I think those are some examples of places where we've seen this the sequencing gap mentioned in the question. And I think the more people we have thinking about how do we get to scale is really important. So yes, we are thinking a lot about that, and trying to find ways to get there. But I just happen to know SAF a little better. So anything you want to add there, Nathan?
I think you're spot on, Julia, and our colleague Matt Lewis talks about this. Make sure to follow him. He
Cool.
is consistently thinking about how do we improve that scale up possibility.
Yeah. And then I see a question around what's the best way to get connected with one of the work streams you showed that are fueling the growth. Great question. You can email us is probably the best way to get connected, because each of those work streams have different leaders at Greater MSP who are kind of coordinating and leading them. So that may be the best thing, maybe a conversation to understand, what interests are, what each kind of work stream needs, who else is involved. But it's a conversation tends to be the best thing. I know that's a little bit old-fashioned, but it's great to talk to people. So please do reach out, and it'd be great to talk to you specifically, Susan. So, and then let's see, how can business leaders advance pro-business policies at a time when both gubernatorial candidates are shaping their platform? Great question. I feel like that might be a question that answers itself in terms of like, this is a time, please start writing op-eds or doing what you need to do. I do think that this is this is an important moment where we have we know who the gubernatorial candidates are, and this is a time for a conversation about it. So, you know, again, I don't know that as a group that doesn't advocate, I don't know that we're the best place to kind of advise on that, but I love the spotlight on the opportunity window we have with the time right now.
I'm seeing a,
Nathan, do you?
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm seeing the question from Wendy Nelson. Maybe Julia, you were looking at
Mhm.
that, which is what is driving the positive net migration for people of color, given our rank and racial wealth gap, homeownership, education gap, et cetera? So it's a really good question and maybe worth disentangling two different elements of population growth, right? Which is, on one hand, you can look at positive net migration, which is looking at the flows of people moving from one part of the country to another part of the country, right? And on another, we can look at population growth overall. And I think it is absolutely true that our communities of color are growing more quickly. And primarily that is because, as was mentioned earlier on the call, they tend to be younger. There are larger families. So there's a higher growth rate on a kind of natural increase is what it's called. More births and deaths happening each year that is driving that positive growth for communities of color. Now, it's a separate question to say, okay, among the people who have the ability to move, are more people moving out or moving in? We would need to look into this. There might be some really smart migration demographic folks on the call who've already looked into this. So feel free to add a chat if you have. I remember looking at a study a couple of years ago that we did that was looking at kind of Hmong American uh, 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 changes in migration. And what we found was there was actually a inflow of Hmong residents to the state because there is such a strong community here. So they're moving from other places. The international immigration for Southeast Asian residents has basically uh, diminished. It's very low at this point, but there's a strong kind of net migration because we're a community that is known to have a really strong Hmong community. So it's a really good question, and I think there's kind of different pieces to tease apart within it. Thanks.
I know we are running up on time. I can stay perhaps 3 more minutes. I know we both have a meeting coming up, and I'm trying to type some answers in the chat. But if we don't get to your question, I will drop my email in the chat, and you can reach out, and we're happy to talk. And you can just email us your question, and we'll follow up or set up time. So let me just do that.
I see a quick question from Bridget Allen Alice. Is Minnesota working with Gina Raimondo and Eric Holcomb, United the Nations Employers, to upskill in the given the presence of AI? Yes, I'm familiar with that effort. We're in the early stages of connecting with a lot of different folks who are thinking about AI and upskilling. So appreciate that nudge, and we'll be continuing to have conversations about kind of how does the Twin Cities economy and the Minnesota economy overall and organizations within it prepare for AI, right? There's likely to be some significant um, opportunities, and there are also some real challenges in terms of job categories that are going to be significantly transformed by AI. So I appreciate that question and always welcome thoughts because we're at this point of connecting with many different folks.
Great, thank you. Do we have any insights on why the latest positive net trend? Placemaking and quality of life may be more important. There's some suggestion that placemaking and quality of life might become more important than economic trends. I don't know that we have awesome data on that. Uh, Migration data tends to be kind of hard, but that certainly would make sense intuitively. But Nathan, maybe you have something to say on hard
Yeah,
data.
I mean, it's a really good question. And, again, there's folks who think about this all the time. So, meet Minneapolis, visit St. Paul. They're doing a lot of work thinking about what is leading people to move. There was research that was released recently that surveyed, people of all ages on their interest in moving to Minnesota in the wake of Metro Surge. And you might have seen this a couple of weeks ago, and the overall finding was that older adults tend to be less excited to move to Minnesota. Younger adults tended to be more excited to move to Minnesota in light of Metro Surge. So there's a lot of factors at play. Certainly, Metro Surge has put Minnesota even more on the map as if the, many, many crises and challenges that this state has experienced over the last 5 or 6 years have not already. But there are these kind of different surveys to try to understand, why do people move? And why are they moving to Minnesota more? Certainly, I am biased, but I would say, the fact that we continue to rank so highly on quality of life has to be a very positive factor in getting people to move here and to stay here and not leave.
Yeah. All right. Great. I see a question on one or two resources specific to income/race and average age, and perhaps we can just close out by putting the link to the dashboard in the chat so that you all have it. And we will send out a follow-up email so that you have our contact information if we didn't get to your questions. And we'll link to the dashboard and circulate the slides from this as well. So
Yeah.
again, sorry, it was a lot of content, whirlwind kind of hour. Thank you for spending it with us, and apologies to questions who we didn't get to cover, but appreciate your time and engagement.
Great questions. Thank you all.